On September 30th, 2000, at 09 Well, Texas, a caver working on an ongoing aid climbing project was involved in an incident that would scar the hearts of many forever. 09 Well holds a special place in Texas history, being designated as a Texas Historical Landmark. This natural cavern, located in southwest Texas, has a mysterious origin, as the exact date of its discovery remains unknown. However, what is known is that 09 Well is the quintessential Texas cave, boasting characteristics that make it both fascinating and challenging to explore. Descending into 09 Well is like stepping into a hidden world. It's not your average cave, it's a multi-drop cave, meaning it has several vertical sections, and it plunges to a depth of around 328 feet. To navigate its depths, explorers must don a wetsuit and possess proficiency in using ropes. It's an adventure that requires skill and courage. But 09 Well isn't just remarkable for its geological features. Throughout history, it's played an important role in the region. Back in the day, it served as a crucial stop along the Ozona-San Angelo stagecoach line, providing shelter and water for weary travelers. Additionally, during the era of cattle drives between Mexico and Kansas City, this cave was a vital watering hole for both cattle and cowboys. Even today, 09 Well continues to be a functional part of the landscape. A windmill stands nearby, still utilized to draw water from the depths of the cave. Joe Ivy was great at exploring caves in Texas. He was especially great at going up and down in caves and helping if someone got stuck. Joe started exploring caves when he was 16 with a group called the San Antonio Grotto. Even though he didn't seem like the type to stick with it, he kept at it and got better and better. When Joe was younger, he wasn't the bravest or the most adventurous. He was more into things like leading his high school band. He was a bit nervous about all the things involved in caving, but as he got older, around 18, he became more confident. By the time he was in his late 20s, people all over the world respected him for his bravery, skills in caving, ability to lead, and funny personality. Joe didn't just explore caves for fun, he also studied the environment. He went to college and got a degree in geography, focusing on taking care of the environment. For 13 years, he worked as a contractor, studying caves and how they affect the land and animals around them. Joe explored lots of caves in the U.S. and Mexico, and he did a lot in those caves. He went into hundreds of caves, and in many of them, he measured how big they were, or helped to do that. In Texas, he played an important role in finding out how long the longest caves were. He led a big effort to explore a cave called Pal de Montemayor, and by climbing up with special equipment, he made it the deepest cave in northern Mexico, going down to 1,690 feet below the ground. Joe was also part of a team that explored Sistema Cuecatica, also known as Cueva Cheve, which is one of the deepest caves in the whole world. Additionally, he led a group to explore Cueva de la Puente in Mexico. People used to think this cave was short, but Joe and his team proved them wrong and found out it was over 5 miles long. In March of 2000, Joe Ivy and Tim Stitch decided to explore a part of the 09 cave called a dome lead. It was deep inside the cave, about an hour away from the entrance. Joe thought he saw something in the ceiling that might be another part of the cave. He had climbed up using bolts before in another cave, and it had led to more caves to explore. To start climbing in 09 Well, Joe and Tim went to a sump room and set up their equipment on tarps. Joe brought a special drill and different kinds of safety equipment, like bolts. First, Joe drilled 2 holes in the rock and put bolts in them. Then he attached a special metal plate called a Kong slide to the bolts. This plate helps absorb some of the shock if someone falls. They used a thick rope and threaded it through the slide, making it safer for climbing. They also attached another shorter rope to the slide to help stop someone from falling too far. As the person climbing with bolts went up, the rope connected to the slide went up through some clips and then down to them. The person leading the climb used a tool called an ascender to attach themselves to the main rope. This tool helped them to adjust the length of the belay rope, which is something the person usually holding the rope would do. On their first climbing trip, both Joe and Tim fell while using this setup, but it worked well to stop their falls. Usually, the falls were about 14 feet long, including how far the rope moved through the slide. In both situations, Joe and Tim tried out a new type of safety gear called a removable bolt, or RB. These are special devices that can be used multiple times and are designed to be put into holes drilled into the rock. Using these RBs meant they wouldn't need to use as many bolts. RBs come in different sizes, and Joe and Tim used both 3/8 and 1/4-inch RBs on their first climb. During the climb, Tim fell unexpectedly when a 1/4-inch RB didn't hold properly, and Joe fell when a 3/8-inch RB didn't seem to be placed correctly. It was really hard to keep the RBs clean and dry before putting them into the holes, and this might have affected how well they worked. After these falls, they decided to stop using the 1/4-inch RBs and only used the 3/8-inch ones because they felt more secure. Joe and Tim went back to work on the climb 5 times, spread out over 3 weekends. On the last weekend, which was September 30th, they managed to clear away a lot of mud that had made it really hard to move during their second weekend of climbing. This mud was thick and sticky, making it tough to handle their gear. The final part of the climb near the top was much cleaner and had better rock to hold on to. Joe started off the climb like usual, setting up the special metal plate system they use for safety. After going up about 20 feet, Joe came back down to where there was a rope already set up and slid down to the bottom. He said he was hungry and thirsty, so he went to eat and drink something. While he was climbing, some other cavers came to the bottom room to check things out. Some of them were still there when Joe came back down. Tim got some tools and gear from Joe, including special stirrups that Joe had made himself. Tim liked using these stirrups better than the ones Joe had brought along because they were easier to adjust. Tim then climbed up to where the rope was tied and hooked himself onto it to start climbing. The rope went through a line of bolts to reach Joe's last safety bolt. Tim moved his climbing gear to the end of the rope connected to Joe's bolt and continued climbing. When Tim stopped climbing, he was close to the top, but there was a big hole there. He saw a narrow passage leading away, but he wasn't sure if it was real or just looked like it because of the way the ceiling was shaped. It seemed like the rope might not be long enough to reach the top. He was tired and out of gear, so he decided to stop climbing and let Joe finish. Tim set up 2 bolts at the top and a rope for Joe to climb, and as he came down, he took off gear to give to Joe. Joe rested, ate, and drank water before he started climbing again. Tim suggested he bring an extra rope, so Joe attached one to his harness. He climbed up and disappeared into the dark upper part of the cave. The other cavers seemed to be exploring the lower part of the cave again, and Tim heard their voices and saw their headlamps. Sometimes he could see Joe's dim LED lights high above. About 30 to 45 minutes later, Tim heard a sudden shout from Joe, followed by a loud crash. Rocks and mud often fell in the cave, but this sounded different. Tim called out for Joe, but there was no reply. And even more worrying, Tim couldn't see any light coming from above anymore. He realized that something had gone wrong with Joe. He called out to Joe several times, but there was no response. Sarah Springer, one of the other cavers, heard Tim shouting and offered to help. Tim explained the situation, and Sarah quickly spread the word. Sean Vincent, another caver, came to help. Meanwhile, Joe's moans could be heard, and Tim became more worried. Sarah joined Tim, and he quickly put on his climbing gear and started ascending. Joe's moans were coming from below where they had been climbing, which scared Tim. When he reached Joe, he saw that Joe was stuck in a narrow space above a muddy slope they had found on earlier trips. Joe's legs were up, his helmet was missing, and there were marks of blood on the wall. Joe was struggling to breathe. Joe fell to about 39 to 59 feet and landed on a steep ledge. Then he got stuck in a narrow space above a muddy slope. Tim climbed up and then down to reach Joe. He saw that Joe wasn't connected to any rope, so he quickly tied one to Joe's harness to prevent him from slipping. He asked Joe about his injuries, and he mentioned having trouble breathing and a messed up left arm. Tim tried to pull Joe out of the narrow space, but Joe yelled in pain. Tim then asked if his other arm hurt too, and Joe said everything hurt, but to keep trying. With Joe's help, they managed to get him out of the slot and onto the muddy slope. There was a small ledge at the top where they could sit, but lying down wasn't an option. Tim thought this was the best place to help Joe, as the only other option was to pass him through the narrow space and rappel down to the bottom. He was having trouble and breathing loudly, so Tim looked into it. Joe's seat harness had moved up to his chest and was squeezing his ribcage. It was a type of harness with loops for the legs, like the Petzl Rapide. Usually, this kind of harness has an extra strap that goes between the legs and keeps the harness in place. Joe had removed this strap from his harness. Even though Joe needed to breathe, Tim was worried about taking off Joe's harness because of the risk of him falling from the ledge. Joe was still partly stuck in the lower part of the narrow space. The slope of the muddy ramp was too steep for Tim to pull Joe onto the small ledge. Time was running out, so Tim decided to get Joe off the wall completely. However, he noticed that there was tension on the rope below him. The rope was resting on two rocks wedged into the top of the narrow space, holding the weight of the climber. Tim asked Sarah to get off the rope, but she didn't know how to switch to rappelling while still on the rope. Tim told her to keep climbing because he couldn't explain how to switch successfully. He then left Joe and climbed out of the narrow space to meet Sarah and help her switch to his part of the rope. However, the rope was stuck tightly in the rocks, making it impossible for Sarah to climb up to him. Instead, Tim pulled her through a wider part of the narrow space below the rocks. Once Sarah joined Tim on the small ledge, she secured herself to the rope above Joe with her cow's tail. Joe had passed out by this time, but was still breathing irregularly. Sarah and Tim tried again to move Joe to the ledge to take the weight off his harness and help him breathe, but Joe was covered in slippery mud and they could only hold on to his harness. Tim used his legs to push against the sides of the ledge and lift Joe up a few times, relieving some weight from his harness briefly before he slipped back down. Realizing their efforts weren't working, Tim decided to get Joe off the wall entirely. He moved the rope from the rocks and threaded it through the narrow space behind Joe and down the ramp. Then he rappelled below Joe and secured him to his own rope with two carabiners. It was clear at this point that Joe wasn't breathing, and administering CPR would have been very difficult given his awkward position, so they didn't attempt it. Sarah, who was an EMT, checked Joe's pulse and confirmed he wasn't breathing. Despite Joe's condition, they were determined to bring him down from the wall. Once on the ground, they could perform CPR more easily. The narrow space made it hard for Tim to access his micro rack, which he wanted securely locked when he took on Joe's weight. Tim had to carefully guide Joe down the muddy ramp, freeing his legs when they got stuck. Eventually, Joe slid onto Tim's cow tail, and Tim rappelled down with him. The micro rack supported both of their weights, and the descent felt safe. At the bottom, Tim found a flat area and searched for a knife to cut Joe's harness off. Charlie Savis and Frank Delgado arrived and helped. Tim knew Joe was likely dead, but wanted to remove his harness. Frank, who was a paramedic, examined Joe and confirmed his death. They tried CPR briefly, but it was too late to make a difference. More cavers came down from the surface with sked litter and rescue equipment to prepare Joe's body for transport. Patrick Lynott oversaw setting up the haul systems, not just for drops, but also in the canal areas. Patrick, Charlie, Frank, Sean, John, and Doug worked together to move Joe's body up 4 rope drops to the bottom of the second drop. They then left the cave to rest around 3 a.m. on October 1st. Calls for help had been made to cavers in Central Texas around 11 p.m. on September 30th, and cavers started arriving at the site before dawn the next day. Law enforcement had been informed during the night and came to the site, closing the entrance with police tape until the justice of the peace arrived in the morning. Once authorities gave the go-ahead, a team of trained cave rescue personnel, led by John Green, the South Central Regional Coordinator of the National Cave Rescue Commission, entered the cave just after noon. Joe's body was brought to the surface at 4:10 p.m. on October 1, 2000. It was a somber day for the caving community, but important lessons were learned. Mechanical ascenders should never be the main part of the belaying system, even with additional devices to absorb fall energy. Using static rope to belay a lead climber is not safe. Dynamic rope with a diameter of 10 millimeters or more should always be used. Relying on just one energy-absorbing device in a dynamic system isn't enough. Climbing harnesses, not caving harnesses, should be worn when falls are expected. Joe Ivy is survived by his partner, business associate, and co-editor, Rebecca Jones, as well as his brother, Marvin Ivy, sister-in-law, Christy Ivy, niece, Ashley Ivy, and a large internationally connected family of cavers. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting caving story.